I submitted a couple of years ago now, so this has been quite a useful exercise in sort of refreshing and rehashing some of my research. And so, again, a bit like Louise said, I'm not going to go over my whole PhD, but I think it's a time to reflect on some of the key things that I've sort of taken forward and things I still want to sort of work on and sort of develop within this. But, yeah, my practice is looking at, well, it started off looking at 3D scan images throughout art practice. So this is a sort of term that I developed for the PhD. It's like the spatially immersive network composites. And throughout it, I guess I sort of, it was a realization of how 3D scanning has been sort of developing within art practice, and how it diverges from other forms of digital imagery. Really, has been sort of really important. So this, although my PhD wasn't explicitly called Aesthetics of 3D scanning images, it sort of became more and more about that. So since then, my sort of research has sort of been working with different approaches to how they can be used and how they are used within art practice. So obviously, it's nice to see Kishan sort of here, because I've been researching forensic architecture and people like ScanLab and Hito Stel, and how they've been instrumental in sort of being a big part of the sort of cultural landscape and using 3D scan photogrammetry as part of their practice. And it obviously has a great tendency to be mimetic, and it has this sense of accuracy within it, inherently within it. However, there's some sort of problematics within this, and there's some other sort of curiosities about their image and how it's, again, like I say, different from other forms of digital imagery, but similarity to post-photography and other forms of composite imagery, which I hit on within my work. So since I started, there's been a whole wave of artists who have now developed, emerging artists who use this quite creatively, breaking up the image and developing its sort of peculiarities within their own work. So I think one of the important things that I developed is that 3D scan image isn't one single image. That it is a combination, a composite, and it's a projection of several forms of data and imagery combined together. So here is a realization of the sort of what is a server center. It's the mesh on the left is this sort of data that is collected of points that are generated through the computer being able to analyze through data sets the different points and colors and textures within space, and be able to sort of triangulate that and calculate where they sit amongst each other. And that becomes this sort of web of points. So I always talk about this as a bit like Christmas presents. So the Christmas present itself is the mesh, and then obviously that has no color or information sort of data. It is just sort of this theoretical three-dimensional object that is held up by computation. And then around it, its color information, its texture information is the Christmas wrapping paper that is put around it. And it's a composite, generally a composite of these different forms of imagery, or normally a collage of the photography that is used to create it as well. And what you get is this computerized projection of both those images together that is, inherently sort of navigable or immersive, depending on how you look at it. That's the combined image to the right. And this is reflected often with, some of the more common data formats. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about computer file formats for the whole 15 minutes. But some of this is quite important to understanding how it operates as an image, and therefore it affects its aesthetics. That some of these come in separate forms. They are composite images that occur as different file formats, and then are sort of combined together. So there, the OBJ is that mesh thing I was talking about, and the wrapping paper is the JPEG image that the computer knows exactly how to put that upon that three-dimensional form. And the other file there is basically the information to be able to sort of tell those two how to interact, sort of to entangle and sort of work together. And so they become these, what I term, so this is my term, as a spatially immersive networked composite. And this comes through a sort of research into several forms of digital imagery which help to explain the sort of culture in which 3D scans occurred, but don't necessarily completely explain the form of image that we see in front of us. So some of this research came from looking at Jens Schroeter's ideas of the transplane image, and that was, there's a massive book there about different forms and ways that people have tried to make three-dimensional images before with holograms or stereoscopic cinema and things like this. And he calls it this transplane image. It's breaking through this idea of the image, the flat image plane, to make a transplane, and these ideas of perspective and depth that we get in different forms of three-dimensional imagery. And within that, he also includes this idea of the spatial image, which also encompasses ideas of sculpture and breaking up the screen through multiple screens as well, which I thought was a really interesting idea, to bring ideas of sculpture as a form of three-dimensional imagery. Now I'll get onto that later about how I've started to break apart photogrammetry in order to examine it. Also, this sort of chimes a little bit with Richard's, which the idea of the image is so networked that you cannot really get away from this idea of it being inherently part of the aesthetics, that the network, an investigation into that becomes part of how it is constructed and how it is viewed and understood. So the idea of this being completely instrumental into how we not just engage with it, but how it looks and how its peculiarities are sort of manifested are caught up with this idea of the computation. It doesn't really exist outside of this, or in its current form on those particular parts of the image. And something I already mentioned is this idea of the composite, which is maybe something that hasn't been spoken about or written about enough with forms of computer-generated imagery or certainly photogrammetry, is that ideas of computational photography, which is I've researched through this and I've brought in, are instrumental to how those images are actually sort of composed. The composite nature of taking images and having algorithms, data sets that are able to analyze that and comprise and put these together are basically how it works. And this came up recently, actually, because after I submitted the work by Alan Warburton, came up about how he was talking about animation and computer-generated imagery. There's a lot of similarities, and basically photogrammetry, its file formats and its aesthetics really are sort of largely borrowed from animation and computer-generated imagery that was developed throughout the 90s, and the reason it exists the way it does is largely because of the way that the work that has been explored and done through animation and games, really. So I want to sort of put this in there because there's a lot of similarity between the sort of different layering of imagery that Alan Warburton talks about within his exploded image. But I think also there's a departure within the sync, or the spatially immersive network composite, which encompasses a moment in which we're existing in. Like photogrammetry in itself is maybe indicative of a whole swathe of images which we're experiencing now due to our smartphone devices and computation and the sort of the ubiquity of networked information that becomes spatially immersive. And by that, I sort of refer to some of these examples as well. So some of these use photogrammetry, but they're also sort of separate in a way. But I would say that all these are kind of spatially immersive network composites. So something like let's take a smartphone filter, for example. It reacts immersively, it's able to gauge through algorithmic processing the sort of depth within your face and able to project onto it. So there's some sort of spatial immersion happening there. And the composite nature is it's projecting other imagery on there, and it's doing that dynamically throughout, live as you're looking at it. And this is the sort of networked aspect of it as well. Like those objects don't exist without the ability to sort of to access the algorithms that process them, but also the sort of networks within the devices we're using as well. They don't exist as sort of paper formats or non-digital computational environments, and they've only sort of started to exist in the sort of last 5 to 10 years in some form. So this is potentially a moment at which we're seeing lots of different sort of spatially immersive networked and different composite images start to emerge, and this is the sort of largely the basis behind this the terrible term, the metaverse. That this is this somehow more immersive form of imagery that we're starting to encounter. So I started working with ideas and ways of breaking this image up, understanding its layering, its composite nature, its network nature. And I started working sculpturally. So this is why I was sort of looking at this idea of sculpture. So I started working with something called Pepakura Designer, which is largely a sort of hobbyist bit of software for people who do cosplay and make Iron Man helmets and sort of want to make little cartoon action figures and stuff out of paper. And it'll take a 3D model, it'll flatten it out, and it'll calculate how you can print this out on a regular printer. And then you cut the paper and you sort of fold it and stick it together. And I thought this is quite an interesting way of sort of taking three-dimensional things that would be so used to sort of being immersive and interactive on screen, and being able to actually sort of flatten them out 2D again and then construct them 3D, and it becomes like a sculptural response. And within that, there is a sort of chewing it up of a glitch culture in which it takes something very complex like a 3D scan, and it makes it into this sort of quite jaggedy, sort of fractured object. And whilst I was doing this, I was also exploring other forms of glitching the form. So I was looking at what actually 3D scanning can and can't capture. And there's quite a lot of stuff that tells you if you've got a LiDAR scanner, or if you've got photogrammetry, it says, whatever you do, don't try and capture a moving object, don't capture glass, don't capture anything transparent or reflective. So obviously I'm going straight for those things because I want to know what they look like. And these are sort of some of the examples that I started to pursue, like this deliberate glitch culture of trying to find out what happens, what happens within the machine when it's actually capturing these things. And these ones in particular are towers of glass with water in them. So some of them half full, some of them are half empty, and some of them are just sort of piled up. So the refraction, the reflection, the sort of transparent nature of it is a real minefield for their algorithm to be able to sort of understand and sort of place itself within the space. And the textures also sort of reflect the environment around it. So as you move around, it doesn't move dynamically. It's plastered on there. It's textured on there. So these become really bizarre sort of objects that become, I don't know, like quite fractured and uncanny in some way. So I started to combine this form of glitch with the Pepakura and started to develop these sculptural works. So this is what it looks like within Pepakura Designer when you start to sort of put something complex like that in. It starts to break it up into sort of different chunks. And actually, I think you can, I don't know if I've got my slide here where I'm going to skip through some of these where I'm actually, oh, I just saw it then. There was one of me. Oh, there. Sorry, it's this one here. So I started to, also you have to print these out on quite a large scale in order to sort of be able to cut them and then fold them into sort of intricate ways. And you can see by the look on my face how much I'm enjoying doing these. So, yeah, these become, again, a sort of, the computation that upholds those images then become, part of the human craft, the artist's nature, I guess, that some of those flaws that are manifested within the works that are shown sort of come not from the computation, but come from living back in the real world, the sort of the idea that, the laws of physics now apply again to these things that, are complete fantasies of the computer, in which they can be suspended in midair, be glass, but also be transparent and not transparent at the same time. So these sculptures sort of, well, I would say, like, semi-successful in that they would be quite ugly and alluring and sort of uncanny and, disappointing to me at the same time, because they would often collapse and they'd look quite scruffy and crumpled. And I think, I think they're also really hard to document within these, because they are a peculiar composite, again, of imagery, photographs collaged into three-dimensional objects. And then when you come to document and photograph them, they look oddly flat or fragmented and unalluring in some ways, I think. And this is another scan of something that is reflective. So this is, again, just a load of stainless steel, sort of different objects that I've put together on a carpeted floor. But then this is the actual paper version of it as well. And within this, there's, I think there's a real sense of disappointment or something unattractive about them. But then there's also something quite alluringly uncanny, and there's moments of it when you're moving around it where you can sort of understand it, but then you get too close, it becomes completely abstract. So I'm going to quickly mention about the project I'm showing at Sparks, because although this is a commission for a charity and it's largely to raise awareness for the issue of ash dieback, it was something that was developed on after my PhD, looking at all these sort of things about the three-dimensional image, the idea of 3D scanning and how it's used, and certainly how it could be used as material. Digital materiality can be used. And this is something that I guess I developed with the idea that, so the idea is that up on Plymouth Hoe, the Smeaton's Tower becomes an ash tree, and it's the ash tree that is dying out, and all these creatures that you can see around them are creatures that are specifically reliant upon ash. So it's partly to raise awareness for this, and it's shown through the HoloLens augmented reality headset. But I also wanted to bring this idea of using scanning as material and anchoring it to the place. So all those creatures, like the woodpecker you can see there, and the snail and the stag beetle, they're created from scans of parts of Plymouth. So like that pile of cannonballs is actually on the Hoe in the War Memorial. So it's actually sort of a playful way of using this fragmented image and collaging them and sort of creating, being quite playful actually with something that is considered to be very scientific and mimetic in many ways. So there's different ways that I've started now to sort of approach ideas of, using the different aspects of this composite image as well. That's all I will say. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay. So yeah, I was kind of a little unsure how to approach today. I was going to stand a bit further away. I feel really close. That's better. I wasn't quite sure whether to approach kind of like looking back into the PhD or whether leaning forwards into the future. So I kind of decided, rightly or wrongly, to kind of do a hybrid and do a bit of both and kind of see where that takes me. So my VI was in 2022 and I completed in 2023. And I think, like many of us at times, I didn't think I kind of get to that point. But after having the kneeling or the hooding ceremony on Monday just gone, it feels, despite how weird that was, very final. So I feel that's definitely happened now. But I do feel like I'm in that kind of in-between space of not kind of working out how I'm going to kind of like take some of the ideas forwards. So diagramming has emerged as a really kind of critical tool to me, and it's been really amazing to see some very awesome diagrams. I'm obviously not the only person who has that kind of like kind of attraction to diagramming. But the practice of diagramming for me kind of provides me with a means to explore and map out the relationships between the constituent parts of my practice, and to form bridges across my thinking in both the artistic practice, the written text, and also to erode some of the distinctions between the two. So I produce hand-drawn diagrams, and this diagram here is actually taken from my Viva, and it kind of like maps out almost like the three parts or the three core parts of my thesis, which is ideas around error as a misadventure of thought, post-digital print, and also agency and relationality. So my practice-led research aims to provide contributions to the expanded field of printmaking. through researching creative and theoretical understandings of the potentiality of error in post-digital print. This context of the potentiality of error has been problematised by working with and exposing print technologies in new and different ways. So my print-based practice, diagramming, exhibitions and the written thesis have together created space for the agency of error and for previously unknown relations to emerge. So the errors in the projects have guided my thinking in parallel with an exploration of key concepts including the post-digital, agency and relationality. And these have helped to frame the significance of the practice as a demonstration of what I refer to as errors in action. So post-digital for me is not a dichotomy. It's many things, such as the actions and the flows of misprinted paper or data or information loss in a computational or a paper system. So my projects explore how the aspect of the digital is important when thinking about errors agency and its exhibition of agency and responsiveness to digital or post-digital conditions. I draw from the latter statement and how the post-digital supports debates for non-human matter by placing focus on the intersect of analogue and digital technologies. And this opens up the conversation on the sites of activity between technologies, humans and error in artistic practice. So my PhD hopes to articulate the way in which errors, print technologies and the paper on which things are printed begin to develop their own sense of agency. The importance of errors' ability to impact practice is a core argument of my thesis. It influences me as an artist and additionally affects the paper and the print technologies which are fundamental components of my projects, as an example of misfeed, which is on the slide here, where the printers are connected wirelessly to Twitter. Jane Bennett's perspective on the liveliness of matter within human and non-human assemblages influences my own approach, where printing and drawing real-time data from Twitter, or as it was previously known, can produce a sense of making, and I call this errors in action. So this is a rejection of inertia or of matter that does not participate in the moment. The snagged paper feed generates a folded, fractured conversation between the printers, the paper feed, and social media. The inherent liveliness and erratic nature of errant printed matter produces uncertainty and pervades creative potentiality. And this is explored in the project's multiple variants and developed in parallel with the written thesis and its drafts. So each version of this project, Misfeeds, uncovers something new. So this version here, which was shown in Chronica in Poland, visualises the network. A second version visualises kind of human and machine voices, and the third exposes a kind of more of a kind of a global paper feedback loop. So I just thought kind of like talk about a couple of the key findings. One of them being liveness as a kind of centering around sites of activity between technologies, humans, and errors. And hopefully I'm going to play you a really short, tiny clip of a video which exposes some of the voices of the printers and the machine assemblage, which I can refer to as a global feedback loop. Will I? No, I won't play video. Oh, did it work? Oh, hold on. That's not going to play now. Oh, with no sound. Perfect. When it's all about the voice of the printers, that's okay. We'll just overlook that. That could be a problem later, but we'll just go with it. The joys of technology, huh? Yeah, and you kind of have to kind of keep going back to that. It's fine. It's really cool. Okay, anyway, so in this project Misfolding, it's a flow of new creative trajectories and forces that occurs live. And this liveness exists in the community of relations, momentarily unifying to make a whole, only to refold and become something other. What I mean by liveness here refers to temporality of error and is distinct from previous discussions where liveliness centres on vibrancy. The artist Winnie Soon writes of how different forces, not a single entity, constitute the notion of liveness as a plane of immanence, and she defines liveness as fundamentally unpredictable. In my project's liveness, error permeates potentiality, and because of its uncertainty, as Soon claims, anything becomes possible. The liveness is visible in the project and through my nuanced understanding of a relational agency that happens in the moment of its encounter. Liveness is inevitably associated with the speed of digital technology, although it also accounts for the relationship between humans, non-humans and machines in misfolding. Soon defines the way technology becomes live, not only for us, but also for itself, and for other beings that are beyond the scope of human reasoning and understanding. And another finding is around kind of ideas of crosstalk, which I can also consider as kind of the language of the practice. So errors are impacted by internal and external conditions. Errors dialogue with paper, printer and internet changes rhythm while misfolding and refolding, twisting and contorting into something new, something other. Bennett writes how things, or errors, exceed their status as objects and manifest traces of independence of aliveness, constituting the outside of our own experience. Errors in misfeed move between different printer bodies, forms and technologies to create dynamic feedback loops between paper, print, subject and system. The performativity of these lively or gentle things is what I refer to as crosstalk, which does not pertain to the individual, but as the project uncovers a material dynamism that captures a communication between things. So the dialogue between the raw material of the project consists of networks, traffic and tweets. And I use crosstalk to tie these different elements together as a material exchange between humans and machines. Crosstalk is a different modality to a language associated with linguistics. An example of the latter exchange is the social media platform Twitter. And when Twitter asks what's happening now, the Twitter tagline as it was, it prompts a human-centered conversation, distinct from the machine dialogue I pursue, which broadly asks the same question of ink, paper and printers. I refer to this machine and print clatter as crosstalk to capture an encounter across platforms, paper, electricity and so forth. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about openings. And that kind of next part is going to be a bit interesting without sound, so we'll just kind of go with it and see what happens. But thinking about kind of the here and now, and also like leaning into the unknown as I kind of feel I am at the moment. I use instructions, I use scripts and scores to explore the critical role of uncertainty and disorientation, and kind of traversing between this space of control and spontaneity to seek the unknown, or as I often think of it, as the crooked path. So instructions act as provocations for me to slow down, to look more closely, to listen more attentively. I adopt analogue approaches to translation and transcribing, printing often laborious text in lead type or in typewriters. And I'm currently working on a set of quite porous projects, which I would like to share a couple of you very quickly. So this first one is kind of this opening around machine labour and exhaustion, which is something that's really carried on with me through the PhD and is really important now. But there's also kind of a slight distraction because I'm also really interested in ideas of the politics of artistic labour and also kind of more recent concerns with institutional gendered labour, which are also on my mind but also somewhat distracting and I'm trying to cast aside. So currently thinking about the temporality of language and of crosstalk and attention to looping information, to returning and repeating, which also relates to some of the ideas that I'm picking back up on with the PhD. And this image here is actually from my Viva. This is actually a live version of my thesis, which is printed on the foreground, and it has a looped paper underneath at the bottom, and then a set of my instructions, which are on the wall behind it. But I'm really interested by this idea about the text becoming something beyond explanation, and this idea about this liveness in a live thesis is something that's still resonating with me. So in terms of some of the openings, my attentiveness to the collaborative labour of machines encourages me to rethink the position of autonomy and normative ways of working, which in recent times has been difficult to maintain owing to the evolving nature of our relationship with semi-autonomous systems, albeit technological, institutional or environmental, and changing modes of artistic production. Further examining the relationality of error, coupled with new openings of labour, performance and exhaustion, creates space for the collective imagination. New works explore these concerns, further dismantling ideas of the individual creative subject and object-based practices, advocating error as a catalyst for the collective imagination, as a disruptive and generative force. As such, any perceived errors that remain in my PhD and this presentation today are generative of new ideas yet to come. So just going to kind of talk very quickly around these new projects that I'm working on at the moment. These projects are kind of like a rejection or like a counter measure to being, either the pressures I feel to be more productive, to be more efficient or more systematic, and to multitask, to be more systematic like a computer, to reject ideas of immediacy or instant gratification. I'm really interested in collaborating with bodies that are not just the printers that I've been working with so closely for 5 years. I'm really interested in human collaboration as well as printer bodies. And the work that I'm showing at the Spark show is also kind of is chosen because of that, because it kind of addresses more of our ideas of our relationships with machines and systems, or our connections and disconnections, perhaps. So very briefly, so a couple of projects I'm doing. One is titled Broken Noses. I have a friend and a colleague called Naomi, and we realised we both have broken noses, and we're also really interested in breakdown as a means to access refresh and renewal, and the kind of the critical role of breaking down. So we're working on some projects together, and kind of it's quite a live project, and about this moment of making or breaking together. A lot of my printers are kind of quite broken as well, which is kind of quite frustrating, and some of them, I think they experienced like an act of violence coming back from a show in Poland, and they kind of just came back as rattly boxes of bits. And I've been thinking for a long time, what do I do with all these things and these objects, and thinking about care and repair and care kits and how those might kind of become part of this body of work. Picking up some of the ideas that I wasn't able to focus on during the PhD, which feel important, is a project called Copy Shop, which is inspired by this German rapper called Romano, who raps about his family's copy shop in Berlin. You should check it out, it's great. And I've got a small residency or project or installation up at UE in the publishing suite coming up. We're going to be kind of rethinking or reimagining these ideas about the copy that have been kind of opened up and called into question through digitisation. And I'm going to be using methods of intervention, conversation, transcription, distillation, voicing, reading, and translating practices. So that's coming up. And then two other things. I'm also part of a new group called Expanded Librarians, and we're looking at automated and constructed and generated content, working with some colleagues, Beverly Carruthers and Robert Good, and we're using machines to collectively map and diagram a space. So returning back to my interest in diagramming, this is a more current way I'm approaching that idea of mapping and diagram, which moves beyond the surface, beyond kind of the edges of paper, and we're looking at 3D camera mapping, sound capturing, and voice to print, which is what I'm doing. This is not going to work, by the way, without any sound, so we'll just have to kind of go with it. So I'm working with some receipt printers, and they've got microphones put into the bodies. You can just look at it because you can't hear it. So this is a very early test that's playing on here. I'm saying these words, which is handy. I've got those texts there, and then the printer is then printing them out. And the idea is that the title of this presentation is Listening to Machines. These are actually listening machines, and they are going to be working on capturing machine stutters and pauses and interruptions and things like that. At the moment, it's a very early test, and it's only capturing humans, and so this is something I'm working on at the moment. And then lastly, this isn't going to work at all. Is anyone getting any sound? I think probably only got a minute, have I? You haven't waved at me. 1 minute. I'm not sure it's kind of going to be worth it, so maybe I'll just introduce it and then we'll see if it happens. So think about kind of that intersects between humans and machines, and I always kind of feel a bit more comfortable if I've got a dot matrix printer with me, capturing kind of and talking about some of this resonance of the machines, but they couldn't be here with me. So this is at the risk of anthropomorphizing machines, and it feels problematic, but I thought I'd just play it anyway to close. And it's this capturing this intersect between human technology and asking ChatGPT, what does a printer sound like? Maybe. Oh, no, it worked, didn't it? Oh. Let me try. Gonna work.
Laura. Write the sound a dot matrix printer makes as if it was words. ChatGPT. The dot matrix printer goes dit 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 drrrr ch ding 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 clack clack cha-ching. Laura. Make a more complicated version that gives more nuance. ChatGPT. The dot matrix printer orchestrates a symphony of mechanical ballet with a rich tapestry of sounds that convey its intricate dance. It commences with a staccato dit-dit-dit-dit, a percussive beat that sets the tempo. Stop. Laura. No, pretend you are a dot matrix printer printing that 200-word text using all of the noises a dot matrix printer would make. D-R-R-R-R, ding ding ding. Clack clack, cha-ching. Dit 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 dit, ch ch ch. Clack clack, cha-ching. How would you make this even more convincing? ChatGPT. To make the representation of a dot matrix printer even more convincing, we can add further nuance and detail to capture the printer's distinct characteristics. Here's an enhanced version. Dit 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 dit. Dar. Ch. Ding ding ding. Clack clack.
I think we could probably finish it there. You get the gist. Thank you, everyone.
Really intrigued by your, Laura, by your Viva at the board. Was that performative within the Viva, or was that done beforehand? How did your Viva play out?
I actually did it ahead of the Viva just because of time, but I'm really interested in it being performative. Like for me, the connections between the ideas only happens in the moment, and then once the diagram exists, it's no longer doesn't serve that same function. Thank you. Could you hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. But yes, in an ideal scenario, it would be performative, and that is something that I've done in residencies before, where the diagramming happens live. I think the connections only exist in the moment.
And did you literally just walk through it with the examiner and kind of refer back to bits, and so it was actually quite physical?
Yeah. I use. I guess it is kind of also to help me kind of like guide my thinking, but I do find it really difficult if I look at a diagram. I just find like a dense mass of information. But the examiners also had like half an hour with the work before that, so they kind of looked at it and they were having a conversation about it ahead of the time, and then I used it as my tool to kind of structure the actual discussion. Thank you.
Any other questions from the floor? I don't have a question, but I do want to say I very, very much enjoyed that the software that you use to generate text translates the zzz noise into snoring. There's something really quite lovely about that, which isn't a question, it's just an observation.
Well, I thought kind of like later in the afternoon, I thought maybe everyone might be a bit tired, and that kind of snoring might be like something you could, I don't know, might be good. Yeah.
Tom, yeah.
Tom, I really enjoyed your kind of, actually it sounds really horrible, your disappointment in your sculptures, but just sort of, I wondered if you attempted to kind of alter them while you were making them because of that kind of aesthetic impulse, and how hard that was, what that tension was like.
Yeah. So it's a curious thing, isn't it? Because like obviously I'm deliberately creating issues for myself and for the process, you know, the software and all the steps along there, really. But yeah, I think there's that's something that I used as, I guess, a way of examining the image in a way. You know, there's something very satisfying about an uncanny, very realistic, what you'd call realistic, successful 3D scan, and how it's the uncanniness or the sort of the realism within that. So like, but then you maybe don't examine the sort of the breakdown of the manufacturing of these kinds of images. So like, for me, it's also about maximising that, or finding out and exploring the different ways that those can be exposed, the sort of the ways that, you know, the texture and the form don't fit together, and they're sort of jarring. So there is interest in there, but like, I think there's also this sense of what, you know, sculpture and what success is within sort of you know, artistic practice, about, you know, when you bring errors in, you know, at what point does this become an investigation? At what point is this a failure of, you know, your craft, or, you know, the concept of something as well? So like, there's all these sort of things and doubts going around your head, especially when it's you physically putting them together. There's something that's quite different from, for instance, putting some software together that I don't know, creates its own glitch that you're not responsible for. So it's a curious sort of dilemma that you're in with when it is made by your own hands, and there's some disappointing or uncomfortable sort of feelings about how it looks, or
Perfect segue. Thank you, Tom. For both of you, brilliant that obviously it's been curated and you've been put together. How you're stressing or trying to find a humanistic fault lines within your use of the data and the technology, and even down to the old dot matrix and down to this kind of, whether it's the body or whether it's just a technology failing and you both enhancing that sense of failure. And now the cutting edge of AI technology, again, zzz, clack, clack, clack. So yeah, just, I wonder, it feels linguistic or, semantic, I don't know, or it's maybe driven from other philosophies around technology not being good enough, or where are the fault lines? Just wonder what's driving your research.
Thank you. I guess for me, it's about that intersect between our relationship with machines and also this tendency to be, so I can kind of make it like to be more systematic, to be more efficient, to be more accurate, to be more precise. But it's really, really weird coming out. So I think about some of the conversations happened today about this idea of digital kind of like hinge on our research, because I'm not really like that. And also digital technologies are getting very good, and so kind of making them trip up. And I think I see both our practices actually, it's almost like this intervention. It's like we are intervening in these practices and these ways of working that are actually really good, and they actually don't really cock up a lot. So it's kind of like trying to intervene in those is where it sits. But yeah, for me, it's very much, kind of a lot of the writing around like post-digital that kind of opens up some of those tensions, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess there's a certain amount of that is true, certainly with the 3D scanning, that they're getting better, so they're better at capturing, but there's ultimately, when you're capturing something that's reflective or transparent, there is something philosophically incorrect about your ability to capture something reflective. You cannot capture that because it changes. That's the nature of, and it's something that's ephemeral, transient. Is the idea of capturing it. This idea of capturing, which maybe goes back to Kajel's maybe slightly colonial idea of what we're doing with representations. So there's an aspect of that I'm sort of just needling and testing at. What is it we think we're doing when we're making these representations here? Really, I think, and that again for me, it's about when you're confronted with an image that sort of breaks down like that, you can't help but just look at the image and the technology itself. You start looking inwardly, and so I think, for me, that's where the fascination is, really. It's that you're able to produce work or imagery that actually doesn't represent anything, or actually represents the machine or the workings, it's technology itself somehow.
I think this might be the same question in just a slightly different way. One of the things that really excited me about hearing both of you talk about your work side by side is about how you both found knowledge and revelation in the transition between analog and digital. And so I guess my question is again about words. Is this what the post-digital means? It was a word that came up earlier.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if it's the words, but there certainly is. I found that the idea of something came up actually during Viber about what is glitch culture, what is it to glitch, and there's this sort of maybe pastiche idea of what it is, and that it's when you see a movie and it's like something goes wrong, it has this sort of thing, and that's a kind of, I guess, a pastiche of what glitch is. But some ideas of glitch, actually, the way I've managed to bring those errors into it were actually really analog. So it's not putting in some high-tech code. It's not like me being a hacker and hacking into it. It's actually just me trying to take a picture of a glass, which is a really, it reverts to something very basic, which is actually probably the best way to actually trip up these machines. It's actually something very elemental, very simplistic, these ideas that have always sort of tripped us up about what is certain ephemeral, transient ideas or objects. So when you put the idea of a capturing machine in there, it can't help but sort of throw up errors or be sort of its nature called into question, I guess. Do you want to say something?
I had something that I kind of just went. I was just thinking it's kind of, well, one I was going to say, but like in terms of the areas, what I really enjoyed it's kind of going away from your question, by the way, but in terms of your sculptures, I really enjoyed where you could see the hand cut marks, and I was thinking kind of that as a technology of cutting, whether it's with scissors or with knives, and where you can see the overlap and it's not perfect. I think it is that kind of, say, that intercept between working in different ways, whether it's analog and digital. For me, it's also about making, in a very rudimentary and low-tech way, machines do things that they weren't designed to do, to create those things. And then I get having these awful, really tricky, horrible conversations like, well, is that really an error? And it's like, and then kind of going down a rabbit hole with what constitutes an error. But for me, it's about pushing something beyond its intention that it was kind of it's intended to do, try and giving it a different purpose and seeing kind of what kind of emerges. I know that the surprises are really slight, so those little errors or mistakes they're tiny sometimes. They're not really kind of physical errors. They're more errors in thought or process, or rather than the physical practice, I think.
Well, thank you both, and thank you all, as ever, for the conversation. We've got...